May we start with a brief reading from The Coddling of the American Mind?
Excellent.
All right. So this book, for those of you who don't know, by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt, The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure, was published 2 years ago this week. It's an extraordinary book. It was based on an article in The Atlantic of the same name, I believe, from a couple of years prior. And Pamela Peresky, who was their senior researcher on the book, approached us along with Jonathan Haidt just as Evergreen was blowing up to talk to us about what we were seeing there. And so we were privileged to be able to see this book as it was emerging. And excuse me. I just want to briefly summarize a couple of their main points and then read a little bit from it. So they start by naming what they call three great untruths, which are what doesn't kill you makes you weaker, what they call the untruth of fragility, always trust your feelings, what they call the untruth of emotional reasoning, and life is a battle between good people and bad people, the untruth of us versus them. This, of course, is akin to what we've been calling the battle between the star-bellied sneetches and the sneetches without. That was cat chaos in the background, if you guys could hear that. So in this final section of the book, they refer to those truths and they say, okay, but what may explain them? And they say, we present 6 interacting explanatory threads: rising political polarization and cross-party animosity, rising levels of teen anxiety and depression, changes in parenting practices, the decline of free play, the growth of campus bureaucracy, and a rising passion for justice in response to major national events, combined with changing ideas about what justice requires. So all of those, of course, are, if anything, more relevant, more apropos today than when they published the book. And, of course, books aren't written the day they're published. So when they were writing this, when they were first seeing some of these things emerging on campus in particular, and they point to 2014 as a sort of a pivot point. And then they wrote their article in The Atlantic. I can't remember if it was 15 or 16. And then this was published 2 years ago. And here we are today with, such extreme examples of polarization on the streets and all of these things, but also to look to their last one, changing ideas about what justice requires, right? So here they have, earlier in the book on page 75, 76, they describe a scene from September 6, 2017. So this would have been after Charlottesville, within a month or so of Charlottesville, I think. And I just want to read to you their description of what happened here. Appeals to common humanity still work just as well today as when Dr. King made them. On September 16th, 2017, on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., a group of Trump supporters organized a rally they called the Mother of All Rallies Patriot Unification Gathering. Counter-protesters from Black Lives Matter showed up and shouted at the Trump supporters. The Trump supporters shouted back. Someone on stage told the Trump supporters to pay no attention to the counter-protesters. They don't exist, he said. Hawk Newsom, the leader of the BLM counter-protesters, later said that he expected to, quote, stand there with his fist in the air in a very militant way and to exchange insults. Tensions mounted and onlookers recorded video of the potentially explosive situation. Then the Trump rally organizer, who goes by the name Tommy Gunn, took the stage. It's about freedom of speech, he said. And in an unexpected move, he invited Newsom and other BLM supporters onto the stage. We're going to give you 2 minutes of our platform to put your message out, Gunn told Newsom. Now, whether they disagree or agree with your message is irrelevant. It's the fact that you have the right to have the message. Newsom took the stage. I'm an American, he began, and the crowd cheered. And the beauty of America is that when you see something broke in your country, you can mobilize to fix it. But then, as he spoke about a black man being killed by police, the crowd began to turn on him. They booed, "Shut up, that was a criminal," a woman shouted. Newsom explained, "We are not anti-cop." "Yes, you are," people shouted. "We're anti-bad cop," Newsom insisted. He still seemed to be losing them. "We don't want handouts," he told the crowd. "We don't want anything that is yours. We want our God-given right to freedom, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now they were coming back around. People cheered. Someone in the crowd shouted, "All lives matter," which is usually intended as a rebuke to those who say that Black lives matter. But Newsom responded in the tradition of Pauli Murray by drawing a larger circle around everyone in the crowd. "You're right, my brother, you're right. You are so right. All lives matter, right? But when a black life is lost, we get no justice. That is why we say Black Lives Matter. If we really want to make America great, we do it together. The crowd cheered and chanted, USA, USA. In an instant, the two groups were no longer us and them. Their ideological differences remained, but within that larger circle around them, their enmity melted away, and at least for a short while, they interacted as fellow human beings and fellow Americans. It kind of restored my faith, Newsom said when interviewed afterwards. Two sides that never listened to each other actually made progress today. One of the leaders of Bikers for Trump came up to Newsom afterward and shook his hand. The two men talked and then posed for a photo together, with Newsom holding the other man's young son cradled in his arm. So that has many of the elements that we recognize from today's protests and riots, and yet has a very different tenor, in part because members of both sides, the would-be leaders of both sides, are willing to say, you have a space to talk here, and we are going to listen. We don't have to agree. People on our side may yell at you, but we're going to listen.
I want to point out, you read that description from Coddling of the American Mind, known informally in some circles as Coddling.
The Coddling.
About Hawk Newsom, who had gone to the Trump rally as a BLM supporter and had that very extraordinary interaction. Mm-hmm. Now, if you haven't seen the video of that interaction, you should look it up. Just look up Hawk Newsom. I'm sure it's on YouTube. It'll be one of the early results. It's an absolutely beautiful thing. And I must say, it represents a possibility that hovers everywhere, right? People are, in general, decent. And if you are willing to give them a chance, they will very frequently give you a chance, and you can cross these bridges. And you and I have been doing this. It's extremely rewarding. There's no reason you shouldn't do it. However, the tragedy of that particular case is that Hawk demonstrates on video, and many people saw it. I mean, it was like the kind of stuff that brings you to tears in an environment like this, that Hawk obviously has that capacity within him.
As did the leader of the pro-Trump movement, but I don't remember his name.
Absolutely.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
However, if you will check in with Hawk more recently, he is no longer of this mindset. And I think that this represents really a catastrophe because...
What do we see?
Well, so you should look up a podcast that John Wood Jr., who, if you're not familiar with him, but that sounds familiar, you may remember him from the Black Intellectual Roundtable that we did on DarkHorse. So John Wood Jr. Is an ambassador for the organization Braver Angels. And the Braver Angels podcast, John had Bob Woodson, a friend of ours, on with Hawk Newsom.
Who was Bob Woodson, who marched with King in the 60s. He's an original civil rights activist from the 60s.
He is an original civil rights activist, and this is interesting. He marched with King. He was originally very much on board, and then he watched the movement change, and he parted ways with it, and he's been doing amazing work ever since. Mm-hmm. So really high quality work that has saved a great many people. But
definitely speaking now from the right side of the aisle, not the correct side, the right side. So he's a Republican now.
He is, but at some level, he is on the personal responsibility side of things. On the other hand, personal responsibility demonstrably works, and he has been absolutely tireless about this, and the positive effect is undeniable. Mm-hmm. So he speaks with a great deal of credibility. Hawk Newsom was having none of it on this podcast.
So John Wood Jr. is leading a conversation between Bob Woodson and Hawk Newsom. Okay.
Yeah, and basically, Hawk Newsom effectively repudiates his openness that he displayed in the interaction with the Trump supporters.
When is this? Do you know?
It's last 3 months.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's so sad. And it unfortunately reinforces the point that I was trying to make, which is that even this this book that was written 2 years ago, well, that was published 2 years ago and written, 2 years and 1 and 2 years before that, which was pointing out how dire a situation we are in, and was able to find a couple of examples of good faith and openness. Even those doors are closing, right?
Yeah.
And that we are not seeing anything of the kind of openness and generosity of spirit, or imagining that other people have intentions and honorability just like you do, that we were even a couple of years ago.
So I think the thing that I'm getting out of it, even in a very polarized environment, there are still things on which you might agree.
Yeah.
Right? In other words, there are things that are simply good for the nation, and we can be divided about a lot of stuff, but we should agree, obviously, on the stuff that's good for all of us. Why wouldn't we? It'd be insane not to, and it would be crazy if there was nothing in that category. But our style of interaction has now produced an assumption that if it's good for you, it's bad for me, right? This can't help but be a disaster. And what it means is that we are botching the stuff that should be within our grasp. Yeah. Right? If everybody feels good when they watch a BLM guy and a Trump guy have a positive interaction in which they come to agreement about the fact that all lives are valuable, right? If that makes people feel good, you would imagine there'd be a lot of it, because it would be but what happens is one gets demonized for it. So if you have polls that are serving their own interests, selfish polls that don't want us to find common ground because it is not in their interest that we do so, what they will do is they will demonize you when you seek it. And I must say, this is in the Unity 2020 context, I have seen a huge outpouring of patriotism and decency amongst people who have gravitated to it. But I have also seen the most amazing emergence of this bitter, toxic, cynical, despicable voice, right? Where people, look, you can disagree with Unity 2020 if you want, right? You could say, well, it's too late. You could say, I don't believe that your anti-spoiler measures are actually going to work. So we have to reject it. But the thing that has come back at me has been the accusation that it is not a good faith proposal, that I am actually up to something, that I'm working for somebody, or that I'm trying to accomplish something greedy or something like that. And it's a shocking thing. But if you take out the content of that accusation,
it's always the first thing that shows up, though, isn't it? I mean, we've seen this, and we've heard from other friends who've gone through the looking glass that is one of the first. If you emerge and you're standing, if you have a movement that appears to be, that has some traction and has some support, the things that start getting lobbed at you are, you're working for Koch brothers, right? You're part of the Fox News network. You aren't what you say you are. You're grifting. All of these things will show up.
You're serving your own interests, right? So I find this shocking, though. I mean, on the one hand, I think it basically, if you take our motif of you're very often better off turning down the sound on human interactions because you'll understand better what's going on. Mm-hmm. In this case, you can't really turn down the sound, but you can turn down your focus on the actual content of the accusations. And you can say, when a party sees its interest in division, right, when it doesn't want unity, what will it do? Right? It will drive up the costs of anything that tries to find common ground, right? Yeah. And so the point is, when you see something seeking common ground, and then you see it taking fire from outside, this is simply what it is. Somebody doesn't want that middle ground discovered, right? They don't want the 70% of Americans that the Hidden Tribes report identifies as the exhausted middle that basically agrees on what direction the country should go. Doesn't want that thing to unify. It needs it divided. And so that the punishing of the honorable middle is just so despicable. And we should name it somehow, and then just learn to recognize it, because it's going to happen every time. And since the only way out of this pickle is finding some path in which we can do what Hawk Newsom did in that interaction, where we can cross bridges and find the humanity in our fellow Americans or fellow Portlanders or whatever, if that's what has to happen, then we've got to be able to resist the accusations that come back at you when you attempt it.